Hello, folks who are here and also folks who might be watching or listening later. My name is Elliott Spaeth and my job is helping people think about their own teaching and what's going well, what they might like to do differently. You might know me from my work teaching on the postgrad certificate in academic practice, the MEd in academic practice, or this might be a completely new experience for you, in which case, hello. I always get a bit awkward in these kind of recorded moments at the beginning. It feels a little bit like when you're on an answer machine and you start leaving a message and it ends up rambling. So hello, today we're here to be talking about inclusive learning and teaching. So hopefully you're all here at the right link. This is where you are hoping to be. We've got 7 people. Oh, good. We've got another couple of people that have turned up. That is great. For anyone that has just turned up, I have put a link and a code on the PowerPoint slide there. There's also a link in the chat, which is just a question prompt for you to answer if you would like to, that we'll come back to a little bit later in the session. Today, we're going to be talking about 2 main things. One is how our learning and teaching practice is currently excluding people. What is it that we're doing currently that might not be working for everyone? Why is that, etc. And what can we do to make both our, just dropped my phone, lovely, to make both our interactions with students and the actual design of our teaching more inclusive? And ideally for me, it would be something that is as interactive as you want it to be. So if you have questions, if you want to answer things that I've asked, or just have a comment that is not something that I've asked, then you're really welcome to communicate that in whichever way you prefer. So typing in the chat is completely fine. I will be trying my best to keep an eye on that throughout. Or you can just unmute yourself and speak if you'd like to, or under the reactions button, there should be a raise hand option, which will enable me to see quite easily if somebody has got a question. And again, you are very welcome to either have your camera and mic on or off throughout. There's really no obligation either way. I will have mine on because it's probably the way I have designed the session, but there's absolutely no pressure for you to. But equally, I don't want to feel like you've got to have it off because I'm meant to be the important one and I'm the only one that people should see. So that decision is yours throughout. And if at any point you need to disappear to get the door or anything, then there's no need to ask. It's totally fine just to go ahead and do that. What might be really helpful, if you wouldn't mind, would be putting something in the chat about introducing yourself and what kinds of things you do in your work, if it's learning and teaching, what in particular, and if there's anything in particular that you were hoping to learn about today, or if it's just more of a sort of general, I don't know, but I think it would be nice to learn more. So if you wouldn't mind putting that in the chat now, or if you would prefer to speak, it's fine to do that instead. You can just press the raise hand button. That would be ideal, just so that I don't end up designing this about something that none of you are at all interested in. This is always the difficult part of teaching, isn't it? Because it's Zoom doesn't have the same features that a lot of other software has, where it tells you if someone's typing. So you're sort of sitting there like, well, either this is completely fine and people are finding this a productive time for thinking or contributing or whatever, or I'm just, giving everyone minutes to sit, wondering when I'm going to start again. Chris, you have raised your hand. Go ahead. Hello.
Hi. I thought it might be less awkward if someone speaks, so I'll go. Yeah, I'm Chris. I'm a lecturer in accounting in the business school. I am on an LTS contract, so I'm interested in thinking a bit more about my learning and teaching practice. And when I saw this on the website, it mentioned active learning, and that's something in the business school that we're moving towards. is having more of that active learning. And it did make me think, actually, you know, what are the implications of that for inclusion? Because obviously we might expect more from students in terms of participation, and even thinking about things like engagement and how we measure that in a way. You know, is it the person who speaks up in class that we think is the engaged student? But actually, I'm actually personally quite a shy person, not very loud speaker. So does that mean that I wouldn't be considered as participating well? So all of these things just kind of went through my mind. And just generally, I'm quite interested in kind of diversity and inclusion. So I thought this would be an interesting session today. Thanks.
Brilliant, thank you. I will, if there's anything of that you feel like I've not really touched on enough, then please feel free to say, because I sometimes may get distracted because I have ADHD and I can always stand to be reminded. So thank you. Kirsty.
Hi, I much the same as Chris. I just sat re-editing the thing that I was writing in the chat about 5 different times, being like, no, it's not quite that. Oh, I don't know, why am I here? Why did I think this was interesting? What, like, I was having an existential moment. Anyway, hi, I'm Kirsty. I'm based in the MVLS graduate school and I'm LTS contract as well. I do a lot of my teaching around kind of biomedical sciences and stuff like that, but I'm very interested in kind of challenging like the existing frameworks for how we view science and how it's seen as a very kind of pure fact-based thing, whereas actually there's, especially with regard to kind of the diversity of the human race and a lot of things that we say, well, science, we don't have to worry about things like race or gender, what have you, because it's just hard facts. And it's being like, well, science is done by people, so it impacts. And so I think that's really interesting. My specific, when I was looking through the CPD stuff with regard to this, I thought it was really interesting about the idea of who is the default student and how we tailor especially when we've done all this kind of online pivot and we're trying to kind of do hybrid, and how, especially with say neurodivergence. I mean, I am also on a path of, do I have ADHD? Possibly I do. Let's look into that. Great fun. But also the kind of, as someone who is some flavor of neurodivergent, I'm working out how I support students with neurodivergence, but how also my neurodivergence might also impact how I structure my teaching, and the assumptions that I make about students and how people generally work, and also the frameworks that I have come through in my learning and how I continue to perpetuate them in my teaching practice. So there's lots of kind of unpicking there. So yeah. Waffle, ramble, sorry.
No, not at all, not at all. I do think that like what you said and what Chris has said combined could be like about 10 hours worth of interesting conversation between all of us. So it's great to hear those things. And I can also see Wendy and Colette have put some things in the chat about what they'd like to know, and just thinking about more generally what's important to consider within accessibility and inclusion work. One thing I'll say before we move on is, if you have something you'd like to type in the chat that's sort of in response to something specific I'm talking about now, if it's going to take more than, say, 10 seconds to type, if you could just type like a little ... in the chat so I know to wait before I move on, or like be like, okay, I think somebody's got something to say, that's fine. Otherwise, it's just an incredible guessing game, which I'm not very good at. But please feel free to interrupt at any point throughout. It's not going to be a formal thing, but those things on the slide are the things that we'll be generally covering, although I wouldn't say it's as clear as all in one section and then all in another section. Unfortunately, it's a bit complicated and it all overlaps quite a lot. So just to introduce myself as well from an inclusion perspective, I am disabled, I am neurodivergent, I am trans, and I am asexual. What else? Have I run out? So there's a number of inclusion criteria that I have personal lived experience of, but there are others that I do not. I have a lot of privilege in that I am white, and that I have like a long line of academics down my dad's side of the family. So obviously I don't speak for all marginalized people, and I certainly don't have any kind of authority on subjects that I don't have any lived experience on, but I'm still happy to facilitate discussions as best I can around those. So I think the kind of inclusion approach that people will be most familiar with is the idea of reasonable adjustments, which is the idea that based on the Equality Act 2010, it is unlawful to discriminate against people due to a number of protected characteristics, including disability. And so reasonable adjustments are a measure that can be taken to try and mitigate that sort of differential treatment type thing. So the idea would be that at the University of Glasgow, for example, if you had a student, generally the path would be that they would go to the disability service and they would talk about what their learning needs are. The disability service would help them think about what it might be possible for example, for lecturers to do differently or for them to be able to do differently. And then that would get sent to various people in the department. And eventually that would filter down to you folks doing the teaching. And then by that point, it's sometimes something that's a little bit unclear, like things like be sensitive with group work. And it's quite hard, I think, for a lecturer to necessarily know quite what that means. I think it could mean several things, and I'm sort of the expert. So it's certainly a good start to be able to be in a situation where we can say, you know what, like I can see that, for example, you need longer in your exams because of dyslexia, or it's important for you to be able to have a way of recording this because, well, for lots of different reasons, to be honest. And reasonable adjustments tends to align a lot with the medical model of disability, which is the idea that disabled people have some sort of deficit, there's something wrong with them, and the adjustment that we're doing is sort of helping make up the gap so that they're able to function better. And I do want to make it clear that I do think reasonable adjustments are a good start, and I'm very pro reasonable adjustments being done, but they're not enough by themselves. The accommodation approach is another way of referring to the idea that we're using reasonable adjustment. So it's like the idea, it's kind of got this vibe that like, oh dear, I guess this disabled person, I guess we can make an exception for them, we'll accommodate them, I guess. And it just feels a little bit like, to me as a disabled person, like I'm sort of a burden, but people are willing to put up with it, I guess. And there's a number of issues with it. It singles out learners. It means that they need to actively advocate for themselves and seek those adjustments. They need to keep arguing for it. Sorry about the ambulance outside. Even if people say no. And it reinforces the idea that there's some sort of issue with them, which I don't think any of that's really what we're going for as a university or as individual educators. And I think it often gets to a place where the lecturer, teacher, whoever, person working with students is in a position where they're like, I'm not sure whether I should address this with the student because I don't want to make them feel uncomfortable. But if I don't address it with the student, then how will I know what it is that I could do that can support them? So it feels like it's a bit of a difficult catch-22 situation for people. So a situation where there's no good answer. The university, my understanding is, subscribes to the social model of disability, which is the idea that disabled people, sorry, just saw your message, Kirsty, which is fine. I'm just like, it looks interesting and I'm going to try and finish my sentence. Disability might cause impairments, but well, no, that's wrong. Wait, a condition might cause impairments, but the thing that is disabling is often the fact that we're in a society that was specifically built in a way that does not assume that people like that will exist, and that caters specifically for people who are a certain way. And I would say the social model of anxiety, no, that was a PhD, moving on, of disability doesn't necessarily imply that every single difficulty that a disabled person experiences is because of the environment. There will be inherently challenging things, potentially, depending on the condition, but the environment is the thing that is really potentially providing barriers, I suppose, is the way of putting it. Kirsty, you are so right about the issue about gatekeepers. So Kirsty said in the chat, would it also include the issue that there are gatekeepers in whether you hit a need threshold? It's not on the next slide, but it is something I feel extremely strongly about. And I don't want to go on for a long time about this because I don't, because I could. But what I will say is, yes, the issue is often that people are not necessarily believed that they need something. It's something you'll see a lot in relation to COVID. So disabled people have been saying for decades, you know what, it would be great if I could work remotely, or wouldn't it be great if I could attend this remotely, whether it's an appointment with a doctor or whether it's a conference or whatever. And often they're told that's just not possible, or you couldn't possibly do your job that way. And whilst it was only marginalized people that needed that, a lot of places were like, sorry, no. And as soon as everyone needed it, as soon as non-marginalized people needed it, suddenly it can be done. And so there, it does feel like if people deem it to be worthy and needed and deserved, it will happen. And who it is that gets to decide those things is very complicated, especially since diagnosis is not the gold standard that we might think it is. There are a lot of conditions that aren't very well researched, often because they predominantly affect women or people that don't fit that sort of traditional privileged person. There's a lot we don't know about conditions, like you'll see examples of skin conditions are always on white people, for example. And so therefore, not only are marginalized people less likely to be believed when they go to the doctor. I mean, I think we've probably all heard a lot of stories about women going with severe issues and having it passed off as period pains or just being emotional. So actually getting a diagnosis is something that requires the condition to have been researched enough and GPs taught enough about, that often hasn't happened if it's a condition that predominantly affects marginalized people. And then the doctor interaction itself needs to be something where it's taken seriously. So somebody not having a diagnosis doesn't necessarily mean they have less need, but it does mean that they might be considered less valid. And that is why reasonable adjustments can only go so far, especially if we're requiring medical evidence to gatekeep who is allowed to have them. So this sort of brings up what I think Chris was alluding to at the beginning that I'd mentioned in the blurb, which was, we talk a lot about active learning, both widely in the pedagogical world and at this university. It's our big thing. I'm a fan, generally. To me, active learning is about the idea that students aren't going to learn just by hearing something. They are going to be needing to make meaning of that in their own minds. And sometimes people will feel able to do that just based on listening. They can immediately make meaning and connections. And sometimes we can facilitate our activities, our learning, our teaching in a way that actively encourages people to do those sorts of thinking. And to me, that's what active learning is. I think in a lot of places it's synonymous with group work, which is where I think there can be challenges. But either way, I like to think that active learning is a source of student-centered learning. So we're thinking, what is the student going to be doing now? Not just what am I going to say and when will I do my bit on that? But like, okay, well, at this point, I'm really hoping that they're going to be discussing how they could apply these or comparing them or that sort of thing, evaluating. Of course, sometimes there are facts that need to be learned, but often there's thinking that we require beyond that. It's not much use for a doctor just to know lots of symptoms of things if they wouldn't know how to apply those in different situations, for example, and what evidence there is and where that evidence has come from. So when we're thinking, okay, well, what do we think the student will be doing? We have to rely on our own idea of how we think somebody is going to react. And I think for a lot of people, that's likely based on how we would react. I think that's how I judge a lot of things, is by, okay, well, I think I would react that way, so I'm guessing most other people will. I will say that as a neurodivergent person, I have learned that a lot of people, most people maybe do not in fact react the way that I think that they will. It's been a learning curve. And I think the point of this is that actually, I think a lot more people than we think aren't going to behave in the way that we absolutely expect. So if we're thinking, okay, what's a student like? We're probably thinking about people that we've seen before as students, probably people with more privilege, probably the people that are in the research methods, the people that things have been tested with in studies, and the people who are like the people that wrote the textbooks, who are often, not always, white and male and cisgender, not disabled, heterosexual, neurotypical, an academic background, not a carer, able to study full time. There's a list that goes on and on and on, but we do have these sorts of expectations in our minds. But what that means is that when we're designing the teaching, without even meaning to, we're already creating an unlevel playing field, because we're designing it for those students that we have already designed the system for. And this isn't something I think people should feel ashamed about. It's just a thing that's quite likely, that we base things on the experience that we've had, and the people that we've seen, and that's how it is always going to be. The problem comes really is when we assume that we have a level playing field as it is. People often assume, okay, well, the status quo is fair, and I guess we can give these disabled people some extra help, I suppose, although I'm not sure that's really fair. A lot of people seem to have that sort of approach. But in fact, it's already a sort of playing field. It's like I like to say it's a little bit like if you were doing a test of speed and there were some rabbits in the test and there were some horses in the test and there were some fish in the test, and you decided to do it on land. You know, the fish isn't going to be able to contribute, but it's not because a fish can't go fast. I have no idea what speed those different animals travel at, so please do not expect that to go any further. And I think as an institution, we talk a lot about widening access, widening participation. I think that's a very broad thing. We want people to come here. We want them to feel welcome here, but that does necessarily involve quite large systemic change to actually create an environment that is supportive for a broader, more diverse lot of people. And I think often it's like, okay, no, I really want people to feel included, but I don't want to have to change everything. I mean, we're all busy, we've all got massive workloads. There are a lot of barriers at different levels to this, but I like to say it's like inviting my friend Jen for dinner, who is a celiac and will be poisoned by gluten, and only feeding her bread. You know, it's like, well, I did invite her, but really, how welcoming an environment is that? So the question is, what can we do to make it better? That is a sort of a rhetorical question, but it is also one that if you have answers, you are very welcome to contribute them. It's another concept that is really interesting and I find confusing, because I'm sure that I didn't use this concept in my inclusion course, and yet all of my students pretty much cited it, and it's a brilliant idea. So it will now be incorporated into the course moving forward. Thank you very much, 2G, from first semester this year. It's the idea of the ideal student, which is a little bit like the implied student, but really relates to that question I asked at the beginning, which is, what behaviors would you associate with a good student? And I think in our heads, we often have an idea of what a good student is, what they would do. So let's have a look at what you folks said. There's lots of good things here. Let's have a look. So we've got contributing, engagement with materials, asking questions, attempting the work, listening, being curious and critical, being able to internalize standards, being interested, engaged, and communicating and enthusiastic. So I quite like the fact that a lot of these are really more internal states than they are visible things that you would see. And the reason that I'm pleased about that, I'm just wondering what I'm going to have on my next slide. Give me one moment. Okay, yeah, there we go. Good, it does go next. Good. Because I think we do make a lot of assumptions about student behaviors and what that means, and then we react accordingly. Like I've had people say to me, I don't want students to use laptops in my classroom because if they ended up doing something like going on Facebook, it would just be so disrespectful to me, and etc. etc. Very valid feeling. And there are valid reasons for not finding laptops necessarily the best thing for people to be using in the classroom. However, I think it's often based on the assumption that the laptop will be making the student do worse work. It's quite a paternalizing approach in a way, the idea that, these adults in our classroom, we're essentially telling them how we think they should learn best, and we're actively preventing them from doing the things that might actually help them learn best, purely so we can feel like they're learning. So I've been thinking about this recently, like the criteria, for example, for diagnosing autism and ADHD, lots of other conditions as well, are based on behaviors and not on the internal state of the person. So it's more like, well, how do you bother others with your ADHD, Elliott? And less, well, why is that happening? What's the internal thing? And for me, a behavior in itself is generally not that, doesn't tell you a great deal unless you know the reason behind it. Like somebody having a snack in class probably isn't trying to somehow assert their dominance over you. They're probably got low blood sugar. They can't focus because they're hungry. And the paper that I've linked there is still a preprint, but it is one by me and my colleague Amy Pearson, who is at Sunderland, who specializes in research on autism and neurodiversity in general. And in that, we talk about some practical strategies for learning and teaching with neurodivergent students, and why in particular the assumptions that we make about neurodivergent students might be particularly faulty. So here's some assumptions that we might have about students that might end up guiding our behavior. So if a student's doodling or using a device, they cannot be paying attention. Not true. People who have ADHD or people who have traits of that, and probably lots of other people, actually can focus better when they're multitasking. Long story short, ADHD brains don't get the fuel from the environment like everyone else does. And when they don't have the fuel, they stop being able to, the brains stop being able to pay attention. And that's why people take stimulants for ADHD, because it makes the brain be like, oh, right, finally I've been fueled. It's kind of like having a leaky fuel tank in a way. So the medicine sort of puts a stopper in. But there's a really nice theory that I like, that is that the hyperactivity things, whether that's mentally thinking about a lot of things or physically doing a lot of things, is actually a way to auto-regulate and create the fuel for your brain so that you're then able to pay attention. So think how frustrating it is if somebody's like, well, you're not allowed to doodle because you need to pay attention. And you're like, but I only can pay attention if I doodle. Complicated. Everyone works better in groups is one that I was told about 10 years ago, which made me angry. Some people I'm sure do. I'm not one of them, but that's fine. There are certain ways that people should behave, and that's just appropriate and professional. Now, of course, there are situations where there are like safety regulations, and those are very important to follow. But I'm talking more about like it's unprofessional to sit cross-legged, which I'm doing right now, or it's unprofessional to speak, to use certain language, or it's just not appropriate to. And often it's quite internalized societal norms that we're talking about there, that really are just a way of saying, well, actually, some people don't like it, or society as a whole tends to think that that's not a marker for success. But I I can tell whether a student is engaging with learning. I cannot count the number of times since the pandemic I've had lecturers say to me, it was just so much easier before the pandemic because I could tell whether they were engaging. And I think in some cases they definitely could. But like Chris said, in a lot of cases, could you? Really? What about the shy student who is doing exactly the same thinking, but maybe just doesn't want to speak about it? Or the student that would be perfectly happy to type it, but is a bit worried that, like, if they speak verbally, that they'll get the language wrong and then people will judge them. So that's, I mean, it's similar to an engaging student is a student that actually attends the live session. Not necessarily the case. You can watch it at home and engage lots, or you could attend the lecture and sleep the whole way through. Another one is more information is better, but cognitive overload is a real thing, and too much information means people won't be able to process any of it. My responsibility as an educator is to make sure I have control of the class. It's a personal non-favorite of mine, in that it can often imply quite a rigid power dynamic, the idea that you as the lecturer need to be almost feared to be respected, and that this power distance between the authority figure, the lecturer, and the non-authority figures, the students, is a positive thing for learning. I don't personally feel that it is. Open to having my mind changed on it. And online learning is just worse for everyone, which I don't think is true. I do think that some people it's really awful for, and some people it's fine for, and some people it's great. And usually it depends on how it's facilitated. I have no idea what slide is coming next, so let's have a look. Okay, yeah, that works. So the first thing that I think is important when it comes to thinking about what we can do to be more inclusive is breaking that idea down of the imagined and the ideal student in our minds. And one way to go about this is to start thinking about, okay, well, what are these behaviors that I associate with being a good student? And what are some other reasons why, like, what are some reasons a student might not be able to do that, that's not to do with their, I don't know, inherent value as a person? I don't know. I mean, I don't believe in inherent value as a person anyway, but it's just things like, I think we want students that are able to ask questions, right? Because that suggests that they're engaged, and it suggests that they are actively thinking about things without us having to make them do it. And then it's like, okay, well, what we really want is that underlying thing. The asking questions itself isn't so important, it's the underlying thing. Similarly, speaking up, great. But what if there's reasons for not speaking up that aren't about the fact that you're not having really critical thinking about stuff? It's just about the fact that there might be other barriers. Language, anxiety are two small ones. Even turn taking for conversations is very difficult for me as a neurodivergent person, and it can be easier not to have to engage with that in the first place. There are lots more things like this that we just associate, and I think often it's like, well, a good student will know all of the rules, but often, how are they really meant to know all of those things? My personal favorite is, well, a good student, well, oh no, I didn't tell them that they were going to have to learn this, but like they'll just have figured it out. And I think that it's difficult when this is usually come from a lecturer who has a lot of experience in an area and they're just hoping someone will pick something up. So that reconceptualizing is a really good place to start. Okay, good. But how do we do that is the real challenge. Universal design for learning is a useful framework for thinking about these things. It's not a one specific way of doing things. It's really a framework that refers to the idea of proactively trying to design learning in a way that is inclusive, rather than just always doing things the same way and only making changes if somebody needs specific reasonable adjustment. But how do we do that without relying on our idea of an implied student? In a way we can't, but being open to stories, experiences, feedback from students is one way of starting. And if a student comes to you and says, I really find it difficult doing things this way, being able to think, okay, I guess I don't need to decide whether that's a valid or worthy need of the students, but I can think about whether it's possible for them to be able to develop this skill in a different way or demonstrate this skill in a different way. So the most important thing about that really is that inclusion is a process and not an endpoint. And I'm sure there are probably lots of things that I do that some people find doesn't work for them. I hope people feel able to come to me and let me know so I can try and make things better. But I get a lot of imposter syndrome about teaching this subject area because it's my favorite one, but also it sort of gives this idea that I have all the answers, which I don't. And I think it's quite scary, that idea that somebody will come and be like, well, you think you know all these things, but actually you're rubbish, which may happen. Probably not though, because I think mainly people just care that we're trying and that we're not waiting to know the definite answer before we actually start doing things. The three pillars of universal design for learning are providing multiple means of engagement, multiple means of representation, and multiple means of action and expression. The website I've put on the slides, which is ahead.ie/UDL, is not the original site that introduces universal design for learning, but it is one that's from Ireland and it specifically focuses on higher education. They've got a lot of really good resources on this kind of thing. Highly recommend it. To get a bit more detail on this, what this means is think about different ways that you can present content, facilitate activities, get students' attention, so that if there's one way that isn't really working for people, then there should be something that helps them. Multiple means of representation. So not just having your standard English speaking Western whites people in the stories, in the case studies, in the literature. And that's where decolonizing the curriculum comes in. I think there's quite a lot going on at the university about that. And then multiple means of action and expression, which is allowing students to contribute in the ways that work for them. The challenge with this, of course, is that if you give everyone lots of choice all the time, there's the possibility that that will be even more stressful for people. Saying you can do this, or you can do this, or you can do this, they might be like, oh my goodness. And I'm not saying I have the answer to that, but I do think that you can provide a couple of options, or even one, and say, and if anyone doesn't want to do that, you could just do this instead. A really simple answer when it comes to active learning is, if you have group work, rather than saying, discuss this with your partner or discuss this in groups, you could just say, have a think about these prompts for the next 5 minutes. And if you'd like, write down some notes. And you're still asking them to think about the same thing, but it's just not having that assumption that people are going to definitely have a better experience in bouncing ideas off other people. Some things that can be helpful: being really clear and explicit about your expectations. I'm aware that often things will be flexible and open, in which case you can explain to students that that's the case, but trying to give as much information as well, no, because then that's going to end up with cognitive overload. Trying to be as explicit as you can about what it is that you're looking for is really helpful, especially when it comes to assessments, tasks. Because otherwise you end up in that situation where you think, well, they did answer the question, but it wasn't really what I meant. And it's a difficult place to be in as a marker. Give students a way to get in touch if they have any learning needs. You can explain this in your classes. You can put it on the Moodle and say, you know, I've got office hours, or here's my email address, or here's an anonymous form. Something that I have started doing with my inclusion course is having a little learning questionnaire, which is for the whole class to answer little questions on Mentimeter this time, on what their preferences are. And I got really surprised, because one of them that I asked was, if you knew the answer to the question, would you prefer to be the one to answer, or would you prefer somebody else did? And I thought, well, because everyone's in this session are like kind of educating, they're academics, they're all going to want to be the one that answered the question. And only one of like 13 of them did. And it made me think, okay, I want to give everyone the chance to participate in a visible way, but some people may prefer not to and might get just as much out of learning that way. Allow different ways for students to participate. So I think Zoom chat is a really good way of this happening, in that for some people it is just easier to be able to contribute that way. Of course, it makes it difficult for the lecturer potentially to have to keep track of those things. So there is an impact on you as well. Use different ways to present information or facilitate activities. And use examples that reflect the diversity of the students you're working with. And one core thing that I think can be really helpful about this is, when you're coming at it from a course perspective, one of my students described this as thinking about what's non-negotiable, and I really like that wording. So taking for a moment the assumption that you're not going to currently go through re-accrediting your courses to make them more inclusive, your intended learning outcomes should tell you what students need to be able to do by the end of the course. And your assessments should tell you how students can demonstrate that. And that means that the stuff in the middle is kind of up for grabs. Like, if an intended learning outcome is about a student being able to communicate in a certain thing, usually won't specify how. Is there a reason that it needs to be in writing rather than via presentation or something else? Obviously, if the assessment has already been approved, the summative part of it, that would probably need to roughly stay as it is in a lot of ways, unless it's already been written for approval in a way that can then be tailored later. Bit of a complicated one. But I think that thinking about that constructive alignment, which is the idea that your intended learning outcomes and your teaching materials and your assessment are all setting expectations and developing skills and measuring the same things, it's worth thinking, what different ways could students develop and evidence those skills? And if you are in an opportunity where you can think about changing the PIP form with the details of the course, then you can think about, okay, is the assessment giving people multiple different ways to be able to evidence this, or is it really relying on people all having the same preferred way of doing things? It's complicated, and I think a lot of people will probably just want to do things in the way that they expect. Usually in social science, that's often an essay-based thing. But it's just that if what you really want a student to do is be able to do the things that are in the intended learning outcomes, then there's lots of different ways that they could demonstrate that are probably a lot more broad. So I think one of the core things is thinking, actually, there's lots of ways that you could develop this skill. There's lots of ways that you could show that you're good at this. Lots of good ways. Is there a way that I can make space for that? And I think within the teaching activities themselves is the easiest way to do that, because obviously that generally doesn't require having to change a lot of complicated bureaucratic things. The two concerns that I get coming up most often about these two things, well, actually, that's not true. The most often concern I have that comes up is, but what about my workload? And that is so valid. And I always say, I'm really not here to be the person that says, tough, do it anyway, because I don't believe that. I believe that any kind of inclusion stuff you do has an impact on your students, has an impact on you. And if it's going to make you in a situation where you're not healthy, you're not looking after yourself, I'm not here to say that I think that you should prioritize doing that over your own health, because I don't think you should do that. I think that this is a systemic issue that the university institutionally needs to do some things to address, and staff workload is certainly one of those. So that is a complicated one. And it's certainly not a situation where I think you should sacrifice your own well-being so that you can think more about inclusion. The two other concerns that come up a lot, the first one is, what about standards and academic rigor? And I always find this one frustrating in a way, because the standards are usually already a problem. Like, the standards for what is good was set by probably a bunch of people that are already in the dominant power group. So there might be an idea that good communication involves eye contact, right? That's not really true, is it? Like, for some people, they prefer eye contact when they communicate, and some people don't prefer that. For a lot of people, good communication does involve eye contact, but not necessarily. And some people will be able to focus less on the interaction if forced to give eye contact. But the standard for good is therefore set in that neurotypical way. And I think there are a lot of standards like that that have been set, like the idea of good and normal is set in a way that works for a certain set of people. And anything that deviates from that is considered not meeting standards or not meeting rigor. So in a situation where you're concerned about making sure that students are still performing at the same standard, I think what's really important to think is, again, those intended learning outcomes. Because what's important is that they are able to develop and evidence those skills. And if they are able to do that well, the other bits I don't think matter so much, unless they're part of an intended learning outcome. So grammar and spelling is a good example. Personally, in PGCAP, we don't mark down based on that. If one of your intended learning outcomes is about spelling and grammar, that's a different situation. But if it's not, and the student has still managed to critically engage with whatever, if that's the intended learning outcome, I mean, that's okay. Then the other one is, what about the real world? Which really annoys me, because in the real world, you can choose what job you do, you know, like you can try and find work that aligns with your particular skill sets and your preferences and your needs in a way that's much less possible in university, from my opinion. So I always find it a bit strange when people say, well, in the real world, they definitely won't be able to do X. And you're like, what real world are you living in? Are these the standards you've internalized for yourself? Maybe. To me, the most important thing really is that we're kind to our students, and that we listen, and if there's something that they say would help them, that we think about it. Whether we can do it or not is a different thing, but if we think it's reasonable, that we do it, and if not, that we don't dismiss it out of hand or make it seem like they were ridiculous for having asked in the first place, because it's probably something that unfortunately has happened to a lot of people throughout their lives many times. We also do want to produce graduates that challenge the ableism in the real world. One of my colleagues responded amazingly to this question when somebody said it once, and she said, yes, corporate practice can be very ableist, can't it? Or it's very behind on this. And it's a good point. Yes, we do want to challenge the dominant ableist narrative too. I sort of intended to talk for less time and allow you more time to talk, so I'm really sorry that did not in fact happen. Please let us use the remaining time, and I personally can stick around for a little longer afterwards if people have time and have further questions or want to discuss things more. Now is your time to ask any questions you have remaining about what we've talked about, or stuff that I haven't talked about much that you want to talk about more now. I'll stop sharing the screen so that you have a better view of things.
I think I'll stop the recording as well, Elliott, shall I?
Good idea. Yeah, great.